Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, our live podcast recording. We've got an amazing guest and show for you. But before we jump into the conversation, as you may have noticed, and as I just mentioned, we've tweaked our format a little bit. So why have we done this? On the back of the webinar and fireside chats that we had last year, we received a lot of feedback, and what you guys said was the most useful and engaging part of our conversations was the expert opinions and the advice that our guests offered. And so we are moving to a format, a live podcast recording that will enable you to get more of that, more expert advice, and give you a chance to ask our guests, the questions that will help you develop better programs for your businesses. And so today this is essentially the first live podcast recording, and we will be incorporating some new things like live quick polls to get your feedback so that we can guide the conversation. And as I mentioned again, we are moving to an Ask Me Anything format on the back half of the session, so you can ask specific questions of our guests. So we're essentially refocusing the format to give you what you want. So with that said, let's get to it. You'll see a quick poll here any second now to share your 2021 plans and your areas of focus. I'm really excited about our guest today. We have Dr. Ethan Burris with us, and I've had the chance to become friends with Ethan over the last couple of years. He brings a wealth of experience. He's worked with some really large corporations, Fortune 1000 type businesses on matters that relate to employee engagement surveys, employee listening tactics. He has also done a ton of research in the space of employee feedback. Welcome, Dr. Burris. Thanks for joining us today. How are you?
Thanks, Stephen. Real happy to be here. I'm excited to be able to share some time with you.
Awesome. Well, I used to read bios, but as part of this new format, we're going to ditch that as well. And so I'm going to steal from the Brene Brown podcast playbook, and I'm just going to start with a question. So what's your story? Tell us a little bit about yourself, and how did you get to where you are today? I know that's probably a long answer, so give us like the 2-3 minute version of your journey.
2-3 minute version. All right. So I'm a professor in the management department at the business school. I teach a variety of classes on the people side of organizations. It's everything from how to build and manage teams. I've taught classes around negotiations. More recently, I've spent a lot of time teaching classes around people analytics. So using data and analyses to help with conventional HR issues. And then also a lot of classes around leadership and leadership development. So I've been here, this is the close of my 16th year here at McCombs. I think I've taught just about every program that we have undergraduate. I'm mostly at the MBA level right now and working a lot with our executive MBA population too. So that's kind of one hat I wear. The second hat, so I'm also the department chair, which means I manage the whole portfolio of classes that are offered on the people side of organizations. So it's not only kind of the leadership and how to manage your people, but also classes like strategy and entrepreneurship. So how to start up businesses from scratch. And then the last couple hats that I wear, so I'm the director for the Center for Leadership and Ethics. And one of the things that we do is obviously is creating a lot of curriculum and programming for our students, but also establish a number of partnerships with organizations to try and bring a research and data analytic lens to a lot of these pretty conventionally fuzzy issues, like how do you best select and build a team? How do you best listen to your employees and act on those suggestions? And so a lot of that mission kind of bridges not only the teaching side and some of the frameworks that we give our students, but also the application side. So how do we start to change policies that businesses have to better manage their people? So the last thing I'll mention is I am tenure track, which means I'm research active. And I know we'll get into this in a little bit. I study a concept that I call employee voice, what leads employees to speak up in organizations, having honest and candid conversations with your immediate supervisors, but also the organization at large about things that you encounter in your work. So problems that you face or ideas that you have for improvement, and then how those conversations, what that feedback system actually looks like, how they go. Sometimes really positive, other times a hot mess. And so we'll get into some of the ins and outs of both of those.
Yeah, I have a lot of familiarity with the hot mess side of things. And so, yeah, we actually met as part of one of the last hats that you mentioned in terms of the research you do. And so tell me a little bit about that. How does it work? How do you engage with businesses? I know you partner with some really big brands, some large companies. So, how does that come about? What is that like? What is the involvement on the company side?
Sure. Well, I'll touch on a few different things because, the nature of these partnerships are unique as most client engagements for consulting firms and most partnerships with organizations. So most of my successful partnerships starts with a pretty general question. So I was a visiting scholar at Google about 6-7 years ago, and they had a question about how to manage the voice of their employee. They have a lot of very proactive, energetic, engaged employee base, full of ideas and a lot of feedback. And the question was, how do you best channel all that enthusiasm in not only a functional way for those employees, but also a functional way for the organization so that they can leverage some of those insights and make better policy decisions. And so we worked on a number of different research projects together to try and answer some of those questions. I'm in a similar relationship right now with Microsoft about, again, how to manage the voice of their employee. And so, when the nuts and bolts of that comes to bear, what I do is help them design surveys. What are the questions that we need to ask? And then once we collect some of those data, how can we analyze it in order to provide some insights on what the organization can do to change and better manage those relationships with their employee base. So this is everything from, what do employees care about? What do they find difficulty in speaking up about? And what is easier? What types of topics do managers action on? And is that always the topics that employees care about the most? So it's those questions around, what's top of mind for employees? Are they all comfortable relaying those suggestions and feedback? And then what's done on the back end that actually addresses some of those issues and concerns?
Yeah, the what's done on the back end, that's the $1 million question, right? How do you, I think a lot of more organizations are getting better at, collecting feedback, creating the channels for employees to provide feedback in a variety of different ways. But then once you have that information, really, how do you take that and distill that down into policy decisions that you can take action on? And so we're going to definitely drill into that. And so I'm just curious, are these month-long relationships you have, year-long? What is how do these relationships, in terms of time frame, what does that look like?
Yeah. So it depends on how big and thorny the problems are. So I'll right from the beginning. So some of these are pretty targeted, and it's a relatively short relationship. So 3-6 months, we can dive in. They already have mechanisms to collect surveys from their employees. So we're able to add a few items. They have very targeted questions they want to answer. So once we add those items, we can collect those data, run some analyses, get some feedback right away. My relationship with Microsoft is now going on about 5 years.
Wow.
Through several different cycles. And so, the type of feedback that we're able to give them is a lot more in depth. It's across multiple years. We can start to look at trends and changes over time. And quite frankly, we can also do some pretty sophisticated analyses in terms of how these viewpoints shift and change, and how employee behavior shifts and changes over that time as well. So, kind of depending on the nature of the question, the infrastructure for what data you have in place, how open you are to adding adding items to existing surveys, or for designing a brand new survey from scratch, like all that kind of just depends on and influences the length and the depth of those relationships.
Well, you've certainly, been a help to me as an advisor and providing me with counsel in terms of what we do with the work with the companies that we're working with. And so I'm excited to dig into that and for you to share some of that with our audience today.
Sure.
And I have a lot of questions, and then of course we want to open it up to our live audience. So just as a reminder to everyone that's joined us, make sure that you are asking questions. We are going to take stock of those, and as soon as we open it up to our AMA section, we'll jump into those. Right now, I would just want to take a quick look at the quick poll and just see what people have had to say. So, wow. Okay. The first question was, how many surveys do you plan to send in 2021? More than last. So, almost, 57%, almost 60% are planning to survey more than last year. So even you win this one, excuse me. Yeah, more than last year. And you win this one because this is very consistent. I think you said 100% of the companies that you're talking to are planning to survey more. And are those, what do those surveys look like? Are those engagement surveys? Are they, what kind of channels are we talking about here? Exit surveys, onboarding, what are you seeing?
As far as different types, most of the surveys I see are pretty short and targeted. So, a lot of companies do have like the annual engagement survey that happens once a year or twice a year. The challenge and the problem in today's day and age is the results of those surveys become obsolete very quickly. As COVID environment changes, transmission rates, health and safety standards, choices around return to work, benefits and resources that employees need to do their own work, like as all those things are dynamically changing, it's hard to deploy a survey only twice a year and acquire all the knowledge that you need in order to take action on it. So a lot of the surveys are shorter, much more targeted, and some companies end up doing surveys with a small sample of their population every day, which is then aggregated up over a given period of time to begin some action planning, or at least like once a week. And so that sort of cadence allows you to take actions a lot more quickly and adapt to some of the trends and new challenges that employees are experiencing.
Wow. Yeah. And I want to talk about that because there are a lot of things that we hear concerns about, things like survey fatigue, especially after the last year. And so definitely want to dig into that. Before we do that, looking at the second quick poll question here, the number one, I guess, employee engagement concern is burnout. And so this is a little different to what we predicted, with return to office. I think that was your number one. I had attrition being my number one. I guess there's a case that burnout will lead to attrition. But employee burnout was the top ranked engagement concern for the year at 70%, followed by mental health and manager effectiveness, which I think are topics that aren't surprising. And so, what are your views on employee burnout? Is this like a real thing?
Is a real thing. Yes. I think
so we have reason to be concerned.
My first reaction to the poll is all these things are related. So most of the companies that I talk to are certainly in the planning phase of what return to work looks like. Is that 3 days a week? Is that 2 days a week? Do all of us need to come back? Have we been living and are we working in an environment that requires people to come in the office anyway? And so return to work is about some support functions returning, but the core of what the business does has already been there the whole time. Each one of those is a vastly different strategy that's required in order to be successful. And with each of those, there are concerns about burnout. I mean, the way people are working right now, being in this world of Zoom, it seems like there's a new research article that's unleashed every single day documenting the huge concerns and challenges with facing burnout just because we're all interacting with each other through a screen.
Yeah.
The latest one I've seen is if you get into the habit of doing back to back to back to back to back Zooms, at the end of like 4 of them, you're toast, you're done. And so like some of the work and research is suggesting to build in like very specific 10, 15-minute breaks in between those to let your brain kind of readjust, reset, and then re-engage. That's as much a burnout issue as it is a return to work issue. So as people are coming back to the office, what does that cadence look like for how they set up meetings? And, this may come as a shock, but even if you're physically in the office, you're still going to be in this hybrid world where many of your meetings will take place over Zoom. It's just you're physically in the office instead of physically at home while this happens. So, all these issues are pretty well intertwined. And, most of the trends and feedback that we're seeing is it's just not an enjoyable experience to spend 100% of your day in electronically mediated communications. We have to have some breaks and we have to have some other forms of interaction.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's talk about return to work. I feel like this is a conversation that we just continue to have. And so I don't want to spend too much time here. And I know that a lot depends, the future depends on like the type of industry you work in, the makeup of your workforce, et cetera, et cetera. But, I have had a lot of conversations, particularly around hybrid and, having to, a lot of companies feeling like they are stuck in leaning into a decision one way or another, and just staying in this kind of hybrid, hey, we're going to continue to work in this hybrid mode, is being a little unclear and still somewhat unsettling to employees. And so I'm just curious kind of what you're seeing and on any views on like how this will all play out.
Well, I think to probably state the obvious, there are as many strategies around return to work as there are organizations. And so to try and talk about trends or best practices for one company and see how it transfers over to success for a different company, at least in my point of view, is a little bit of a wasted effort. Mm-hmm. Let me give an example. In Austin, there are a lot of tech companies, and we have a lot of semiconductor manufacturing facilities that happen here in the city of Austin. For a lot of those employees, they never left the office. When you're manufacturing that type of equipment and that type of technology, it requires you to be there. There's chemicals that can explode. There's safety issues, there's timing issues. It requires people to be on site. And so the return to work strategy for some of the ancillary and support functions within those manufacturing sites has to look very different than a similar tech firm, but not in the manufacturing space, where you're doing 100% of your work in software development and all you need is a keyboard and access to a server. And you can do that, quite frankly, anywhere in the world. So to talk about the return to work strategy as the monolith that's going to equally impact all types of organizations, it's just not true. You have to start with what's the business strategy for your company? Yep. What's the requirements of the jobs that need to be performed? And now we can start to have a conversation around what does return to work look like and what are the needs for those employees as they enter the physical workspace again. So I'll give one last example. There's a researcher out of Harvard that's looked at, before COVID, hybrid work arrangements. And one of the trends that he's seeing in his data is that flexibility is great. People love the option of being able to work at home at least some portion of the time. But how you schedule people, and especially teams, is hugely important. Over the course of a 5-day week, if your team only sees each other one day or less because you've scheduled them in different days, that doesn't help the team to gel together. And so as a result, scheduling them such that they have 2 or 3 days as intact teams in the office where they see each other. And then another 2 or 3 days where they can work remotely from home. They all achieve the same flexibility. They all achieve, the same type of hybrid latitude that they can, help manage the kids or run errands and things like that. Yet you're also adhering to some of the fundamentals of what it means to build and maintain and lead a team effectively. And research has shown time and time again that in-person interaction is quite important. So,
Interesting.
A couple different things there, just to summarize real quick.
Yeah.
Nature of the job, nature of the industry, nature of your strategy and business model, the nature of the work itself, all that has to come in for what your return to work strategy is. But then don't forget about some of these fundamental principles for how people interact. Think critically about how you organize this hybrid approach such that you can actually breed the type of team interactions that are really successful.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, because I think that does get lost in the conversation, is some of the, the research. And Katie, one of in the audience, just requested, whether or not we could share some of the research. But, the fact is, so much is being talked about component, and that there will continue to be this remote working component. There hasn't been a huge conversation around like historical research that says teams are most effective when there is in person. And what does that look like? What could that look like? And but I think what I'm taking from what you're saying, and I believe it to be true also, is that much of this depends and comes back to your business strategy, right? What is right for your business? It's like a company-centric view. There's no silver bullet way of, determining what is right. It really is going to be unique to your organization, your culture, and what your business strategy is. And I think that holds true in some of the other things I want to talk about today. Mm-hmm. And so, employee listening, right? That's the main topic for today's conversation. So let's start with, what is employee listening from your view and perspective? There's employee experience, employee engagement, employee listening. Are these different things? Are these just different ways of, referring to the same thing that all ties back to employee feedback? I thought it might be a time well spent just kind of reorienting ourselves around like what exactly is employee listening, and what do you think the goal is?
Sure. So that's like a perfect question for an academic, because you're asking us to, carve out definitions and concepts and how they're similar or different. So I'll provide a couple different answers. The first is, I think in the general public sphere and how companies use these different terms, they're all sort of mixed together. So it's not much of a surprise to me that there's a lot of confusion, or at least a lot of mixing across how these terms are legitimately used by organizations. A lot of companies use the term employee engagement, and what they mean is we like to survey our employees and figure out what they like and what they don't. And to me, as an academic, that's not exactly right. So employee engagement, at least as an academic would define it, is much about their attitude and commitment to the work and to the organization. Mm-hmm. You can think about it just a general measure of job satisfaction. Are you happy with where you are at work? And if that answer is yes, that is a measure of engagement. Now, lots of different facets can go into that. There's things like the Gallup and Q12. I know you've spent quite a bit of time with Workify trying to understand some different questions to ask to get at that. But are you satisfied with your work? Are you satisfied with your supervisor? Do you feel a sense of thriving and flourishing with what you do? All these things are generically correlated pretty highly and all stick together. Yeah. That's engagement. Listening and employee listening systems, again, how I would define that is the method by which organizations try and get some feedback from their employees. And you can listen about a variety of stuff. You can devise a survey that's just about compensation and the performance management review process. Exit surveys is another example that happens when employees leave organizations. That's an example of listening. The theory of that case is you get more honest feedback when people have no career ties to the organization. And so they can kind of drop the mic on their way out and tell you the truth. There's onboarding surveys, there's candidate experience surveys, like all these things are different examples of strategies that organizations use to listen to their employees. An engagement survey is another example of that. So, for me, as you start aggregating up and taking stock of all these different ways, not only through surveys, but through other kind of more informal means. Do you hold town halls? Do you hold focus groups? Are there internal message boards? Are there ERG groups that, summarize concerns from different employee bases? And as you start to aggregate all of those up, and it goes to one central team, now that team can start to devise a strategy. Are we listening to the right people at the right time in order to create action? Are we asking the right questions to the right population to get insight to change policy? Are we missing out on a particular employee group and we need to have a targeted listening strategy just to them? And as soon as you start looking at this as an ecosystem rather than a series of engagement surveys broadly defined, it starts to me, it starts to change the whole nature of this and the purpose of this. The whole reason why you should be listening to your employees is that it should help support the functional business strategy of what you're trying to accomplish. If you're just asking questions to ask questions and it doesn't tie to your strategy, chances are it's going to be a waste of effort, and your employees are going to see that too.
Yeah, and in my experience, the companies that are taking the more agile approach that you mentioned earlier, after the quick poll results, that are asking shorter surveys, I think there are a lot of companies that have one part of the employee listening strategy as you defined it, right? They have an engagement survey, they do it once a year, or they're doing kind of one-off surveys. And I think the more the companies that are really adopting this more frequent approach are the ones that are setting themselves up on the topic of action. If the end goal is action, I do see a lot of companies getting caught up, like wanting to pin, or even HR departments getting caught up on like, where does the responsibility sit? And, with more data, there is, it can be a little more difficult to take action, right? Because I'm not just taking, a one engagement survey, distilling that into kind of 3 or 4 themes, and then, asking managers to take action. How do you view that? And, how do you help, some of the companies that you're working with, how are they balancing, having more data, if anything, with a true employee listening strategy? And where does the responsibility lie in terms of taking action?
It's a great question, and I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to have a great answer for it, because I think every single company I work with struggles with this. That's probably the area that has the most untapped value in terms of both research, but also understanding company strategies and what works and what doesn't. We don't have a good understanding of how collecting all these data transforms into policy changes and actions. So let me try and organize this a little bit. If you start to look at an employee listening system, that type of ecosystem, it's really divided into 3 different phases. What are you doing to collect data in the first place? Again, broadly defined. This can be surveys. It could also be analyzing sort of ambient data. So what's patterns of emails and calendar meetings, and how does that give you insight into, the nature of employee interactions, focus groups, ERGs, et cetera? What are you doing to collect information about your employee base? Secondly, how do all those different data sets tie together and are merged such that you can run analyses and extract some insights about those same employees? And then the third bit is, what do you do with those insights? Now, most of the companies, certainly that I've worked with, and I'll give one pretty clear example in a sec, we think a ton about step 1, a little bit about step 2, and hardly anything about step 3. So one organization I worked with, they organized a huge challenge, they called it. They were going to collect a ton of employee ideas about how to improve. In the span of 2 weeks, it was something like 800 ideas came across their desk, ton of ideas. They thought a ton about how to market, about how to attract employees to give that type of feedback. And they thought very little about what to do with any of that information once they had it. How to pass around to different administrative heads, business unit leaders around the organization, to then evaluate and then decide what, if anything, would be done with it. I'll contrast that with a different organization. It was a 6-week process from beginning to end. 2 weeks to collect ideas, 2 weeks to evaluate and prioritize, 2 weeks to announce implementations. And if you think about that arc ahead of time, all of a sudden that can be very helpful in helping to translate some of these ideas in some functional way to changes that employees can actually see.
And so what I'm not hearing is that, that action is the responsibility of a manager who needs to put together, or department head who needs to put together a specific, 3 bullets in a OKR tracking tool, right? Because again, we see a lot of spinning of wheels, and there's so much data, and employees have so much. The voice of the employee, in my opinion, has never been stronger and louder than it is today. And so, there's we just see a lot of challenges in HR departments wanting to put this on on the manager specifically when they get their data sets, and not getting the result, repeating the same thing cycle over cycle, but not getting the results that they're looking for.
So to me, this is what keeps me interested in this as a topic area. There's a lot of nuance and sophistication in these processes. So if you open it up and ask employees to give you advice and feedback and suggestions, they will give you everything. They will give you everything they have. But if you're leaving it up to their immediate supervisors, their managers, to make sense of that feedback and then take action on it, not all of those ideas are things that manager has the authority, responsibility, and the resources to actually address. So thinking about not only what ideas are communicated, but at what level in the organization is it actually appropriate and useful to take action on those very ideas? You have to think about that matching process. Again, I'll give a very quick example. I worked with a hospital system. And if you ask physicians, nurses, technicians about ways and things to improve the emergency department of that hospital, they will come up with a ton of ideas. And it could be very simple stuff like, changing processes to turn over a hospital room. And that's something that shift supervisors and, the supervisor of the emergency department can action on. But they would also suggest things that would improve patient flow through the emergency department, and then coordinating with all the other departments within the hospital, from the operating room to the cancer wing to surgery. And now all of a sudden, that emergency department shift manager has zero authority to change the patient flow for the entire hospital at large. And so speaking up to that person with an idea that he or she has zero authority and no resources to address just creates frustration on both parties' part. Employee doesn't have their issue addressed. The manager is incredibly frustrated because they hear the issue, they just can't do anything about it. And so again, that ecosystem is not just a way to listen to a whole bunch of people. You have to think about how it ties back to the authority holders in the organization who can actually take action.
Yeah, and I think that's generally the experience that we see, and the feedback that we hear is like we're just not seeing the results. And I do believe there's like an imbalance. The manager obviously plays a key role in the process, but that's one of a chain of command, a larger chain of command that that should be responsible in my view. Well, this time flies by and there's so many questions, but I do want to open it up for specific design questions that we're getting. Before we do that, I mentioned earlier, survey fatigue. And one of the things in the employee listening ecosystem is you're describing it. And I love that. It implies you're opening up more channels, what I would call a feedback channel. So you have multiple feedback channels. And I think for most companies that would be expanding, and if it's also looking at things in more than just surveys. So you mentioned ERGs, you mentioned focus groups, collaborative discussions, and we have a question around that. And so, I think there is this view, I have a personal opinion that employees are fatigued by, receiving surveys. They're fatigued by, being asked to provide feedback. Is that a real thing, or is that just a management kind of illusion, and or I guess a reason to not continue to ask or not to open up more channels?
Yep.
Just curious your view there.
So once again, I think my opinion is a little bit nuanced. There's an article to be written on the benefits of long surveys. And that kind of goes against this notion of survey fatigue. Most of the time, if I start partnering with a company and the length of the survey starts to get fairly long, there's concerns that employees are just going to stop, and it's going to affect response rates, and it's going to create a lot of ire among that employee group. But taking surveys is about effort. Employees expend time, mental energy thinking about the questions, and then effort just giving that type of feedback. And that effort has to be tied to a particular outcome. So if you spend even 2 minutes filling out a survey and you see no change in the organization, to me, that's a signal of survey fatigue, and no one's going to go back to that well and fill out another 2-minute survey. Worked with other companies where the surveys are long, 20, 30 minutes. That's a significant amount of time. And for the organization, it's resources. Imagine the cost for every employee in an organization to spend a half hour on a survey. That adds up super quick when you talk about salary, opportunity costs, etc. But it is also worth it for both employees and for the organization, because those efforts are tied to outcomes. They're tied to changes. And so if employees fill out a survey and soon thereafter, the company comes back with, here are the results, here's what we heard, here are the themes, here's some statistics behind them that make sense and are digestible. And then later they come up with, here's a list of priorities based on what we heard and those themes and those statistics. And therefore, here's the action planning that you'll see in the next quarter that's baked into OKRs or whatever else. And all of a sudden, employees start to see, hey, I spent 20 minutes on this. And here's what they heard, not only from me, but from everyone else in my unit. And here are the actions that they're taking based on those themes that they heard that I gave. And next time around, they're going to be a little bit more excited about spending that time because they see that direct link to action that's taken. So survey fatigue is real, but it's not just about the length of the survey. That's one portion of it. It also has to be considered alongside what's done, because this is about a calculus of effort to actual rewards and outcomes.
Right. So you could look at it as fatigue in providing feedback and not seeing any action or response from the company after I've provided my feedback.
Exactly.
Well, we have some questions, and I think the first question that I want to tee up is around a topic that is huge right now, and we certainly have spent a lot of time talking about it, and that's diversity, equity, inclusion, and I'll throw in belonging. And the question is, you're looking for guidance, resources, suggestions on how to design looking to create open, genuine, and meaningful dialogue with our CEO around employee experiences at work and in the communities. And this is all specific to diversity and inclusion. So what, any kind of insights and feedback that you can offer there?
Sure. So I think the first thing, just to state the obvious, that's an incredibly difficult and complicated question to answer in like 2 minutes or less. That's really sharp and insightful and gives you lots of different work streams to come away from this. So happy to provide some very quick thoughts here. And then obviously if there's some other answers in a longer format, happy to circle back to that person as well. There's a ton of resources out there in terms of how to create different programs, how to elevate the conversation and the attention to these types of issues within organizations, to communicate why it matters, not just from like a business case of diversity, but also an ethical and moral case around it as well. And then how do we start to see some metrics of success with this? What does this look like for, not only those minority communities, but also how they are integrated and belong with the rest of the organization? So lots of resources on the strategies to go about doing that. A lot of that, again, has to be tied back to kind of the core business strategy and culture of your organization to begin with. The one thing that I would offer, and this does get challenging to implement, full disclosure, is that if you're taking action and developing these strategies and having these conversations, and you're not measuring whether any of this works or not, then chances are you're going to miss out. And so there's a broad hesitancy to measure some of this stuff, to cut your, let's say your
give us an example of how you could, when you say measure this stuff, what could that look like?
So I get down to the nuts and bolts. What's your pipeline look like? Can you cut that by different demographics? And then if you deploy a strategy, go back to that pipeline and measure if there's any improvement across demographic representation in your pipeline, in your onboarding process, or sorry, in the interview process. Once you get them inside the organization, what does that pipeline look like? How do they move from entry positions to, up the career ladder? Are you running the numbers to see where the attrition is in those promotion rates? Well, now what are your strategies? As you start to implement them and you have different career and mentorship and coaching programs, well, what's the effect on those trajectories? Is it improving or is it not? If you deploy an engagement survey, are you cutting that by particular demographics? Are you learning if they feel the same as majority groups in your organization? And if not, what are you doing to action on that? Well, if you action on it, are you then following it up with further measurements to see if any of those strategies are successful? Now, again, the risks that are associated with that, there's legal ones. Every time you measure some of these things, it comes with legal obligations to take action, and you need to be prepared for that as an organization to do so. But if you don't, there are significant risks because you are not attracting and retaining talent, and especially in those groups. And if you work in an organization that somewhere along the lines, your product, your service reaches those communities and you don't have representation inside your organization from those very same communities, then chances are you're not doing that as successful as you would otherwise. It's real business, let alone moral outcomes. But if you're not measuring this stuff to know if you're effective, you're almost shooting blind.
Yeah, and I think there's also a business risk within your leadership, right? That if you're not measuring, that you are investing valuable company resources in ways that aren't making any sort of meaningful progress. And so I think that's just an additional layer. But to answer the question, because I do have some thoughts here, that for me, it's really, when you look at design around creating meaningful dialogue, in my experience, it is important to define D, E, and I, or, D, E, I, and B, whatever parts of the acronym that you include, you need to define it in a way that is specific to your company and is inviting, because this can be a very polarizing topic. But, defining diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that will bring people into the conversation. And I think that many times companies are so focused on getting quick wins. So implementing some element of diversity training, getting a diversity statement published onto their website, that it creates room for interpretation. And so your employees, if you have not defined your initiative, your objectives in a way that's inviting to everyone, the risk is that your employees start to fill in the gaps, and they start to fill in the gaps in a way that, that makes sense to them, which doesn't always align with what your goals are as a company in terms of, creating a safe place to have conversations and have a meaningful discussion around diversity and inclusion, and why it's important to the business. Instead, you get too focused on, your employees will get focused on picking it apart and why it doesn't work for them. And so those are just kind of, my thoughts in terms of, how to create that. And I think defining it in a way, to get even more specific, that relates to your values and resonates with employees, and that they feel is authentic and genuine.
Yep, absolutely.
So the next question I have here is, what models have you seen successful around regular collaborative employee feedback? And so this is not individual surveys, but rather group discussions and focus groups.
So I'm not sure if there's a great research, evidence-based answer on that. And, because the way you would start to test that is you look at different organizations or business units within an organization, and then start to kind of manipulate or experiment with how discussions are run, with what cadence, around what topics for one group, and how that's different from another. So I can offer some general feedback and advice here. When you start moving towards focus groups and more collaborative discussions, you're necessarily making some of the data that you collect a lot more informal. So you'll need to think about note-taking or summaries that come out of that then are passed along to different leaders within the organization to learn about those themes and then start to take action. You can also organize those focus groups around particular topics so that they're very focused around the company. But probably those that I think have done this well is that those periods of interaction are almost baked into the culture. So again, I'll go back to what's a pretty famous example at Google, and that's something that they called TGIF, which is their all hands meeting. And of course, it got moved to Thursdays instead of Fridays for TGIF. But and it's a weekly opportunity, and this goes back to the very early days of the organization, back in the late 90s. Every week, the founders of the company would get up and just talk about, hey, here's how things are going. Here's what's new. Here's a new product that's launching. Here's an update on our revenues. And it's a chance to share transparently things that are going on in the organization, starting with the folks at the top. And then they open it up for Q&A. And it's anyone in the company can ask any question they like. Chance for those leaders to give honest and transparent feedback on those very issues. And what started as a company-wide thing in a small startup has now been baked into a culture of the whole organization. They still do those weekly all hands for the entire company. It's now, of course, simulcasted around the world, but a lot of units and teams adopt the same type of cadence. And it just starts to reinforce, hey, if we do this live and in person and you can deliver the honest feedback there, well, now we want to get to these other parts of the ecosystem, the surveys or pulse surveys or whatever else, like that type of feedback culture is there and present. So some of the best practices around this for, what I would say is to look at and leverage those opportunities as a part of your overall general strategy. You can look at this as one isolated incident, and that's fine. We can look at the nuts and bolts of how to extract higher quality ideas out of those interactions. But if you look at this as, hey, this is part of our culture, and this is just one avenue out of many that's consistent with a strategy to hear employees at critical parts of their, employee experience, and all of a sudden that starts to take on a very different meaning.
Yeah, we are seeing a resurgence in focus groups. We're seeing companies relying on focus groups more and more as it relates to, engagement survey, pulse survey, like disseminating part of the actioning process rather than just putting this responsibility on any one person. We're seeing companies create an opportunity for further employee listening. So it's like, the data is just pointing you to where you should be having the conversation. So when you see a low scoring department or you're slicing and dicing your survey data, really that's, directionally, pointing to where you need to have a broader conversation. And, as part of that, again, it's this resurgence of like the old school focus groups. And, that could be led by, a senior HR business partner. It could be, co-facilitated, by HR and the business. But it also, provides a way of, crowdsourcing solutions to some of the feedback that you're getting.
Yeah. One of the significant advantages of focus groups and those types of dialogues, it allows two-way communication. Surveys are great, but once you write the item, that's it. There's no opportunity for follow-up. And so, focus groups allows that type of dialogue. So if someone says, I'm not very happy, you can follow up with why, and now they can tell you. In the survey, you just know that they're not happy.
So next question, regarding the employee listening as it relates to like, non-engagement, non-pulse survey, more at the individual contributor level, what are some best practices on leveraging your exit survey data and in taking action in a meaningful way on your exit survey data?
So specifically just exit survey data?
Exits, yeah. And I mean, if you have any, I think, let's broaden that. The question was specific to exits, but let's broaden that because I think with everything that's happened over the last year, I know companies, a lot of HR departments have had to change the way that they onboard employees. So I think new hire and onboarding is just as important. How employees are being brought into the organization is just as important as, what employees are saying as they're leaving.
So one of the things that you'll want to think about as you start to design surveys to specific populations. So exit surveys is one example. As people are on their way out, you're only capturing one subsample of your organization. You're only capturing data from people who have already said they're leaving. There is no comparison point. So if you identify like career trajectory as a trend among people that are leaving, is that really an issue? Does everyone else in the company also feel that there's a problem career trajectory? So if you're not asking very similar questions among those who stay versus those who leave, you have no comparison point. And as a researcher, we call that a sample selection bias. You are selecting on an outcome, those folks who have already left. And so it could be that the people who are leaving are experiencing challenges in career trajectory, and that could be a good thing because you're exiting the folks that have hit their limits in your organization, and that's wonderful. So before you redesign all this work around career trajectories and coming up with alternative career paths and stuff like that, having a quick check to see if those that are leaving because of the right reasons, that could be a good thing. So having some consistency across the questions that you ask for the whole organization, that's one advantage of an annual engagement survey. It is longer, so you can ask many more questions and make sure that those are similar ones on the very targeted surveys, like for a population that's exiting. That allows you different comparison points.
That's a great point. We are seeing a lot of energy right now being spent on talent development. So growth opportunities, learning and development opportunities, all things talent management right now. And I guess concerns that employees aren't getting what they need, and that ultimately is going to result in them leaving the company. And we're seeing a lot, as we work with companies on this, asking in those poll surveys that you mentioned, the more topical, more frequent poll surveys or engagement surveys, and then aligning that with exit surveys so that they're getting clear data on are we making the right move here? Yep. There's a follow-up question that I want to ask because we're running short on time. Mm-hmm. Was around stay surveys, and yep. And so that, or what I like to call like the in between, right? Because most companies have some sort of onboarding new hire survey, and they have exit, but not a lot are doing effectively doing I guess check-ins in the rest of the employee lifecycle. So any guidance on what companies could be doing as far as stay surveys?
So once you ask a consistent set of questions among your entire employee base, and you're then still tracking turnover later on, you can do some wonderful predictive analytics on what are the biggest factors that lead to turnover. Said differently, what are the biggest factors that lead employees to stay?
Yeah.
And so that's why you want some consistency across a large group of employees, that is the whole organization, because it allows you to understand those critical drivers. And so as you're not only predicting attrition, but now you're also predicting things like performance, promotions, lateral moves, features of collaboration with teams. Those same sets of predictors, those same set of items in your annual engagement survey or even in pulses can be used for those different things. So now you understand, here are the main drivers that would cause someone to just stay in their job, not move, that would cause them to be in a position for promotion, to take on a stretch assignment, or to leave the organization. Are those the same factors? Are they different? Is it the presence of some or the absence of others? You have to have an integrated snapshot at some point in time that allows you that type of insights. Otherwise, you're doing a bunch of surveys with random people that can't be connected or compared with one another. So, to answer the question in the chat, I don't know what the factors are that would lead someone to stay versus leave. You have to have some consistency in the questions asked among a large swath of employees across the organization, and that allows you to extract some insights about those factors.
So what I'm hearing is there really needs to be intention and thought put around the multiple channels of your employee listening strategy. You need to not only align, try to align as best as you can your engagement, your larger format survey, and even the smaller poll surveys with what you're doing at the individual contributor level and surveying across the employee lifecycle. That way you can have the opportunity to connect and trend data. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you to make use out of your data in a meaningful way.
The likelihood of running a scattershot approach and then not being able to extract the insights that you want is very high.
Yeah.
So to think about the core business questions that you have first, and then follow that up with a measurement strategy and a ecosystem listening strategy, that will allow you to extract a lot more value from the data you collect.
Well, I think that's where, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the conversation for today. Dr. Burris, Ethan, it was a pleasure having you. Hopefully, we can have you back on the engagement experts because I felt like we could have kept going for another hour. But I want to thank you again, and thanks everyone for joining us today.